your intervention, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Arya, so much, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody, wherever you might be. It's an honor to be joining with ELNet in this series, where we're going to look into this very complex issues about the role of international law in the situation in the Middle East generally, and we're focusing today on Hamas. Now, it's actually quite strange that we're having this conversation in a way. What in many ways should be a fairly straightforward conflict has become obfuscated and confused by actually a century of history, which has confused our understanding. And I think there's a reason for this, about how to look at these territories. My job is just to give some introductory remarks to the three speakers who will talk in their specific areas. And I want to explore the concept of legitimacy. There's a difference, obviously, between the legality of action and its legitimacy. And Israel's not fighting just a military campaign, it's fighting a war of perception. And one of the interesting things that's come out of this latest round of the conflict with Hamas is in fact, Hamas seems to be winning that international war of perception. This has triggered an outflow of very anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiment worldwide, even though Israel, from its perspective, and we'll hear more about that, is defending itself against indiscriminate attack by a terrorist organization on its doorstep. And the question is, how can that happen? And what does that have to do with international law? Well, when we look at legitimacy, this is a core concept in the UN Charter. What we're facing is a campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel. Now, I think there's probably only one state in the world where there is such a campaign. And the best example to compare it with in the past is obviously South Africa, with the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign to delegitimize the apartheid regime in South Africa. And really what we've seen over the last 5-6 decades is a campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel. Now, on the one hand, Israel is a UN member state, and under the UN Charter, every state that is a member has a right to sovereign equality, which means that every state is entitled to be treated equally. It has a right to political independence, it has a right to territorial integrity, and it has an inherent right to self-defense in Article 51 of the Charter. These are all very basic UN Charter principles. We read in Article 2:4, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. And Israel is entitled to all of those rights as much as any other state. But what we're seeing is completely the opposite. So the second question is, well, why is Israel's existence so consistently and intensively being challenged and questioned? And I think we do have to go back to the history of this region. And in one minute, we'll deal with 100 years of history. But in a way, you could say the confusion was laid with the mandate system, which was intended to implement the Balfour Declaration, which was declared that the British government supported the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And that document, which was implemented in the mandate, which ultimately led to the creation of the State of Israel, obviously carries within it an awful lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. What is a Jewish national home? What does it mean to be in Palestine? So from day one, there was confusion, I think, about what this entity was to be and what it was to look like. And of course, from the very beginning, the Arab world, and particularly the Palestinian Arab leadership, fought with great force to oppose and to prevent the implementation of the mandate. Great Britain was required under the mandate system to enable this policy to be implemented, to enable the Jewish people to return and to settle in the land. Of course, we all know the history of how that didn't happen. In 1947, after the Second World War, the partition plan, UN partition plan of the 29th of November 1947, was adopted to try and partition Western Palestine, west of the Jordan River. Of course, Jordan had been carved out in 1921. It was part of Palestine. It was created to establish a Palestinian Arab state. And now the western part of Palestine was to be divided. That partition plan, as we all know, was rejected by the Arabs and accepted by the Jewish people. And so when the State of Israel was created in May 1948, it was created in the midst of conflict, in the very middle of a war that had already been going on for months since the rejection of the partition plan. And the very next day, the new State of Israel was attacked by the Arab world. So there have never been any well-established borders of the State of Israel. And as the decades have gone past, the 1949 armistice lines, which Israel entered into with Egypt and Jordan, particularly establishing the demarcation lines between Israel and those states, have come to be seen as some kind of frontiers or international boundaries, despite the fact that those armistice agreements say quite specifically that those lines, and in Jordan's case, and now with the Palestinians, that's the green line. It was stated clearly in the Israeli-Jordanian armistice agreement that the line was not to have any political significance as an international frontier or boundary. Nevertheless, the Arab world insisted on treating those lines, and the PLO and the PLO campaign, and we've seen this now before the ICC, has adopted what Europe also calls, and the international community calls, the pre-1967 lines, and the EU even calls them borders in its official policy, has become a kind of mantra that the UN has adopted. And now the International Criminal Court has even accepted that mantra as having some kind of legal significance. We'll come back to that, obviously, when we talk about the ICC. We don't have time to talk about what has happened since the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel gained control of the territories that had been occupied by Egypt and Jordan. But we've seen basically a rewriting of history, I would call it. And this has taken place also within the legal institutions. And I want to mention three key moments in time, as it were, that I think are critical to understand when we think about where we are at this moment, and particularly in relation to this, understanding the conflict with Hamas. Now, since really the Yom Kippur War of 1973, there has been a campaign, and it's been a very open campaign, led by the PLO, supported by the Arab League, with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and its allied states, to campaign for the creation of Palestinian statehood. The first, I think, not the first in time, but the first I want to mention, key thing is the 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. This was a case brought by the Arab world by having a UN General Assembly resolution passed seeking an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice to advise on the legality of the security barrier that Israel was constructing after the Second Intifada. And it was a terribly biased set of proceedings. We'd need another seminar to explain why that's the case. But the result is an advisory opinion in which the court made a number of statements which have been used since 2004 against Israel. One of those is that Israeli settlements are illegal. There's a kind of statement in very general terms in paragraph 120 of the opinion. Now, of course, not all Israeli settlements are illegal. Settlements are not per se illegal under international law because there is no law against settlements. There's only law against the movement, the transportation or deportation of populations into or out of occupied territories. There's no law against settlements as such. So that's a kind of term which has been used against Israel. The second one is that Israel cannot rely on its right to self-defense against Palestinian terrorism coming from the territories. And the court argues that because those threats are not coming from a third state, a foreign state, they don't fall under the UN Charter right to self-defense. This is, again, a very problematic opinion of the court. It's not a binding determination, it's only an opinion. But again, the question arises, does Israel have a legitimate right to self-defense against Hamas terror? That's a question I think Laurie will speak to later. The second point, key event of a legal nature that occurred and that is fundamental was the resolution adopted by the General Assembly 29th of November 2012, giving Palestine UN non-member observer state status in the General Assembly and within the UN. A political resolution, not binding, not intended to recognize statehood, but nevertheless has been the mechanism that Palestine, so-called, has used to accede to a whole range of multilateral treaties and instruments and organizations, one of them being the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute. And again, I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's very problematic that this political resolution has received legal validity and even to the extent of defining the territory of Palestine as the ICC has accepted it.
Andrew, your 12 minutes are over, and as you know, I am the clock keeper.
Right.
So please, we're gonna move to some questions if there are. So I'm turning to Sarah Perez. Do we have at this stage some very specific question for Andrew Tucker?
Not in the chat box, but we received some question that maybe Andrew would like to answer. Let me check. There was one question, which is it possible to prosecute Hamas by the ICC? What is the status before ICC?
Okay, so the ICC, the International Criminal Court, there has been a process since 2015. Palestine acceded to the court, became a state party to the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor of the court opened an examination of the situation in Palestine. She asked the pretrial chamber for a ruling on whether the court has jurisdiction. In February this year, the pretrial chamber decided the court has territorial jurisdiction. That is, it has the power to investigate and prosecute for war crimes, crimes against humanity in the territory of Palestine. And it's decided that the territory of Palestine is the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So according to the court, it can prosecute both Hamas and Israeli and any other Palestinian leaders for war crimes or war crimes against humanity, even in Gaza Strip. I think that's the technical answer.